Hey guys, tonight we begin with a look at another storied franchise, this time the Boston Celtics. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, and which other franchises you'd like to explore. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are places where time moves differently, where the air itself seems to hold the weight of decades, where every breath carries whispers of what came before. The Boston Garden was such a place. The TD Garden, its modern successor, tries to be. But tonight, as we begin this journey together, we're not concerned with buildings made of brick and steel. We're concerned with something more ethereal, more enduring. We're here to speak of legacy, of dreams sewn into hardwood floors, of a franchise that didn't just play basketball. It became basketball's conscience, its beating heart, its most relentless pursuit of perfection. Close your eyes for a moment. Let yourself drift back to 1946. The world is still catching its breath after the Great War. Boston is a city of neighborhoods and narrow streets, of accents thick as molasses and pride thicker still. The smell of the harbor mingles with factory smoke, and in small gyms across New England, young men are learning to love a game that most people still consider a winter curiosity. Basketball is not yet America's obsession. It's barely America's afterthought. But Walter Brown sees something different. He sees possibility where others see distraction. He sees poetry where others see chaos. On June 6, 1946, a date that would echo through decades, he secures a franchise in this new Basketball Association of America. The team needs a name. The suggestions come flooding in. Whirlwinds, Olympics, unicorns. But Brown, in a moment of clarity that would define everything that followed, chooses something simpler, something that speaks to the very soul of this ancient city. Celtics, the Boston Celtics. The name itself carries weight, doesn't it? Celtic, from the Latin celtae, meaning the hidden people. How fitting for a franchise that would spend the next 7 decades revealing hidden depths of human possibility, hidden reserves of will, hidden dimensions of what it means to compete at the highest level. The name connects this fledgling basketball team to something ancient, something proud, something that refuses to bow. Those early years were lean, not just financially, though Brown would mortgage everything he owned to keep the lights on, but spiritually. The Celtics of the late 1940s were a team searching for identity in a league searching for legitimacy. They played in the Boston Arena, a drafty barn that seated 3,800 people on nights when 3,800 people bothered to show up. The floor was portable, rolled out over the ice of hockey games, and players would find themselves slipping on frost that maintenance crews couldn't quite eliminate. This was basketball as afterthought, basketball as sideshow, basketball as something that happened between the main events. But even in those struggling seasons, something was taking root. Call it culture. Call it expectation. Call it the simple New England notion that excellence isn't optional. It's inevitable. The Celtics began to attract a certain type of player. Not necessarily the most talented, but the most determined. Not necessarily the most celebrated, but the most committed to the idea that basketball, played correctly, was something approaching art. And then came Red. Arnold Jacob Auerbach arrived in Boston like a force of nature in 1950, taking over as coach with the kind of confidence that borders on arrogance but somehow transcends it. Red was short and stocky, with the face of a street-corner philosopher and the tactical mind of a chess grandmaster. He understood something that most coaches of his era did not. Basketball was not 5 individuals taking turns displaying their skills. Basketball was a collective enterprise, a shared breath, a synchronized heartbeat. Red's vision was revolutionary and simple. Fast break offense that treated transition basketball like jazz improvisation. Aggressive defense that turned the act of stealing a basketball into a form of neighborhood justice. And underneath it all, a culture of accountability that made every Celtic responsible not just for his own performance, but for the performance of the man beside him. If you played for Red Auerbach, you played for something larger than yourself. The pieces began to fall into place like tumblers in a lock designed by fate itself. In 1950, they acquired the man who would become their first authentic star. Robert Joseph Cousy was a point guard from Queens who played basketball like he was conducting an orchestra. His passes didn't just reach their intended targets, they arrived at the precise moment when the recipient was ready to do something extraordinary with them. Cousy could thread a basketball through spaces that seemed to violate the laws of physics, and he did so with the kind of casual elegance that suggested such impossibility was, in fact, quite ordinary. Watching Cousy play was like watching language being invented in real time. He created a vocabulary of movement that had never existed before, a grammar of deception that turned the simple act of dribbling a basketball into something approaching literature. The behind-the-back pass, the no-look assist, the stutter step that could freeze a defender in place like marble. These were not merely basketball techniques. They were expressions of possibility, demonstrations that the human body, properly motivated, could transcend its apparent limitations. But Red understood that artistry without substance was merely entertainment, and entertainment without championship was ultimately meaningless. The Celtics needed more than beauty. They needed strength. They needed presence. They needed someone who could impose his will on the game itself. They needed Bill Russell. The story of how Bill Russell came to Boston is one of those historical accidents that feel so inevitable in retrospect that they seem like destiny. Red Auerbach saw Russell play in the 1956 Olympics and recognized immediately what he was watching: the future of basketball defense, personified in the long limbs and intelligent eyes of a young man from Oakland. Russell was not just tall. At 6 feet 10 inches, he was certainly that, but he was tall in the right way. He moved like water, anticipated like a mind reader, and blocked shots not with violence but with the kind of precise timing that suggested he could see the future just a few seconds before it happened. Acquiring Russell required a trade that would define both franchises involved for generations. Red dealt Cliff Hagan and Ed Macauley to St. Louis for the second pick in the 1956 draft, then used that pick to select Russell. It was a gamble that would have been impossible to make without absolute certainty about what Russell represented. Red didn't just draft a player. He drafted a philosophy of how basketball should be played. Russell arrived in Boston in the middle of the 1956-57 season, having delayed his professional debut to compete in the Olympics. His first game as a Celtic was December 22, 1956, against the St. Louis Hawks, the very team that had traded away the rights to select him. The poetry of that timing was not lost on anyone paying attention. Russell scored 6 points that night, but points were never the point with Bill Russell. He grabbed 16 rebounds and did something that would become his signature. He changed the entire geometry of the basketball court simply by being present upon it. Defense, before Russell, was largely a reactive enterprise. You waited for your opponent to make his move, then responded to it. Russell transformed defense into something proactive, something creative, something that could dictate the flow and tempo of a game as surely as any offensive system. His blocked shots were not mere denials, they were redirections, conversation changers, momentum shifts that could alter the entire complexion of a contest in the space of a single possession. But perhaps more importantly, Russell understood something about winning that would become the spiritual foundation of the Celtic mystique. He understood that individual statistics were not just irrelevant. They were actually counterproductive if they came at the expense of collective success. Russell played basketball like he was solving a complex mathematical equation in which his personal numbers were variables that could be adjusted, manipulated, and even sacrificed in service of the one number that mattered: the final score. That first season with Russell established the template for everything that would follow. The Celtics finished 44-28 in the regular season, then fought their way through the playoffs to face St. Louis in the finals. It was basketball as theater, basketball as literature, basketball as the kind of human drama that makes fiction unnecessary. The series went 7 games, each one a study in the subtle art of pressure, the delicate balance between confidence and desperation. Game 7 was played in Boston Garden on April 13, 1957. The building was electric in the way that only comes when everyone present understands they are witnessing history being written in real time. Russell was magnificent, grabbing 32 rebounds in a performance that redefined what was possible from the center position. Cousy orchestrated the offense like he was conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And when it was over, when the final horn sounded on a 125-123 double overtime victory, the Boston Celtics had their first championship. But more than that, they had discovered who they were. The celebration that night was both joyous and somehow inevitable. This is what the Celtics were meant to be. This is what Walter Brown had envisioned when he chose that name 11 years earlier. Not just winners, but winners who elevated the very idea of winning into something approaching philosophy. Red Auerbach lit his victory cigar on the Boston Garden bench, the smoke rising like incense in a cathedral dedicated to the pursuit of basketball perfection. It was a ritual that would become legendary, a small act of defiance and celebration that somehow captured the essence of what it meant to be a Celtic. We are not merely satisfied with victory, the cigar seemed to say. We are so confident in our victory that we celebrate before it's officially complete. That first championship was not an ending. It was a beginning. Over the next decade, the Celtics would construct the most remarkable dynasty in professional sports history, winning 8 consecutive championships from 1959 to 1966. 8. Think about that number for a moment. 8 years during which every other team in the league was playing for second place. 8 years during which the Larry O'Brien Trophy might as well have had "Property of the Boston Celtics" permanently engraved upon it. But to understand those championships merely as accumulations of wins and losses is to miss their deeper significance. Each title was a lesson in the art of sustained excellence, a master class in the delicate balance between confidence and humility that defines all great dynasties. The Celtics of the Russell era didn't just win games, they won them in ways that elevated the game itself. consider the 1960 championship team, which many observers consider the finest basketball team ever assembled. Russell anchored the defense with the kind of presence that made opposing centers reconsider their career choices. Cousy ran the offense with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the creativity of an abstract expressionist. But surrounding these superstars was a collection of players who understood their roles so completely that they transcended their individual limitations through sheer collective will. Tom Heinsohn was a forward who could score from anywhere on the court, but who understood that his primary responsibility was to make everyone around him better. Frank Ramsey came off the bench with the kind of energy and purpose that transformed the very concept of the sixth man from afterthought to difference-maker. Bill Sharman could shoot the basketball with the kind of accuracy that bordered on supernatural, but he was equally committed to the defensive principles that made the Celtic system function. And presiding over all of it was Red Auerbach, who had evolved from coach to architect to spiritual guide. Red understood that his job was not merely to draw up plays or manage minutes. His job was to create an environment in which excellence was not just expected, but inevitable. He did this through a combination of tactical brilliance and psychological insight that has never been equaled. Red's practices were legendary for their intensity and their intelligence. He didn't just drill his players on fundamental skills, though he certainly did that. He drilled them on the mental aspects of the game, the little decisions that separate good teams from great ones, the subtle recognitions that turn basketball from sport into art. A Celtic player didn't just know how to run a fast break, he understood why the fast break was psychologically devastating to opponents, how it could be used not just to score points but to break spirits. The championships accumulated like perfect sentences in an epic poem. 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966. Each one unique, each one inevitable, each one a testament to the power of collective commitment to an ideal that transcended the individual ambitions of any single player. The rivalry with the Los Angeles Lakers during this period was not merely athletic competition, it was philosophical warfare. The Lakers represented everything the Celtics were not: Hollywood glamour, individual stardom, the kind of basketball that prioritized style over substance. Jerry West and Elgin Baylor were magnificent players, artists in their own right, but they played for a franchise that never quite understood what the Celtics had discovered: that basketball, played at its highest level, was not about individual brilliance. It was about the mysterious alchemy that transforms 5 separate human beings into a single, unified force of will. The Lakers would lose to the Celtics in the finals 6 times during the 1960s. 6 times they would arrive at the pinnacle of their sport, only to discover that the summit was already occupied. It was heartbreaking and inevitable, and somehow necessary, as if the basketball gods had decreed that true greatness could only be measured against the backdrop of sustained excellence. But even as the championships accumulated, something else was building within the Celtic organization, something that went beyond wins and losses, beyond trophies and parades. The Celtics were developing a culture that would outlast any individual player, any single coach, any particular era. They were becoming an idea made manifest, a living embodiment of what it meant to pursue excellence not as a destination, but as a way of traveling. This culture was perhaps most perfectly embodied in the relationship between Red Auerbach and Bill Russell. When Red stepped down as coach in 1966, he didn't look outside the organization for his replacement. He didn't conduct a national search or interview established coaches. He simply handed the clipboard to Russell and said, in effect, "You understand what we're trying to do here better than anyone. Keep doing it." Russell became the first African-American head coach in major professional sports, a milestone that was both historically significant and somehow utterly natural within the Celtics system. Of course, Bill Russell should coach the Celtics. He had been their spiritual leader as a player. Why would he be anything else as a coach? The transition was seamless, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Under Russell's coaching, the Celtics won 2 more championships in 1968 and 1969, bringing their total to 11 titles in 13 years. 11. The number itself seems to mock the very concept of competitive balance, to suggest that for more than a decade, professional basketball was less a competition than a coronation ceremony, with the Celtics ascending to their throne year after year after year. But all dynasties must end. Russell retired after the 1969 championship, taking with him not just his individual brilliance but the institutional knowledge of what it meant to be a Celtic. The man who had transformed basketball defense from reaction to anticipation, who had redefined what it meant to be a winner, who had carried the franchise on his shoulders for 13 magnificent seasons, was moving on to other pursuits. The Celtics faced the 1970s without their cornerstone, without their identity, without the gravitational force that had held their universe in perfect order for more than a decade. For the first time since 1950, they were ordinary. They were mortal. They were just another basketball team trying to figure out how to win games. The early 1970s were a wilderness period for the franchise. Not just because they weren't winning championships, though that was certainly jarring for an organization that had grown accustomed to measuring success only in terms of ultimate triumph, but because they seemed to have lost the thread of their own identity. Who were the Celtics without Russell? Who were the Celtics without Red stalking the sidelines? Who were the Celtics when they were merely good instead of transcendent? These were not merely organizational questions. They were existential ones. The Celtic mystique had always been built on the idea that certain standards were non-negotiable. Certain expectations were simply the baseline from which greatness could be achieved. When those standards weren't met, when those expectations weren't fulfilled, the entire edifice seemed in danger of collapse. The team struggled through mediocre seasons, failed coaching experiments, roster construction mistakes that seemed to violate everything the organization had learned about what it meant to build a championship culture. Dave Cowens, drafted in 1970, was a warrior in the Celtic tradition, a player who approached every game like it might be his last, who brought the kind of intensity and intelligence that Red Auerbach had always prized. But one player, no matter how committed, could not single-handedly resurrect a dynasty. John Havlicek was still there, a bridge between the Russell era and whatever came next. Havlicek had joined the team in 1962 as a sixth man who could do everything: score, rebound, defend, run for 48 minutes without apparent fatigue. He was the consummate Celtic role player, a man who understood that his job was not to be a star, but to make the stars around him brighter. As the 1970s unfolded, Havlicek found himself thrust into a starring role he had never sought, carrying the offensive burden for teams that lacked the depth and defensive identity that had defined the franchise's golden era. The 1974 championship was a redemption song, a reminder that the Celtic way had not disappeared, but had simply been dormant, waiting for the right combination of talent and circumstances to reawaken it. That team, led by Cowens in the middle and Havlicek on the wing, played with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from understanding how precious and fragile championship opportunities truly are. They weren't as talented as the Russell-era teams, but they were every bit as committed to the idea that individual sacrifice in service of collective success was not just a strategy, but a moral imperative. The finals that year against Milwaukee were a clinic in the art of competitive stubbornness. Game 6 went to double overtime, a marathon of will and endurance that seemed to last forever and end too soon simultaneously. Havlicek scored 36 points in that game, playing all 58 minutes with the kind of relentless energy that had defined his entire career. When it was over, when the Celtics had won 102-87, Havlicek collapsed on the court not from exhaustion, but from the sheer emotional weight of what they had accomplished. 2 years later, they did it again. The 1976 championship was different. Phoenix instead of Milwaukee, triple overtime instead of double. But the essential drama was the same. The Celtics finding a way to win when winning seemed impossible, discovering reserves of will that they didn't know they possessed, demonstrating once again that championship basketball was not about physical superiority, but about the mysterious process through which ordinary human beings transform themselves into something extraordinary. But even as they celebrated those mid-1970s championships, everyone understood that they were endings as much as achievements. Havlicek was aging. Cowens was wearing down from years of playing basketball like he was trying to personally stop a runaway train. The roster around them lacked the kind of depth and intelligence that had characterized the great Celtic teams of the past. By the late 1970s, the Celtics were in decline again. Not just competitive decline, though their win-loss record certainly reflected their struggles, but cultural decline. The standards that had defined the organization for 3 decades seemed to be slipping. The expectation of excellence was being replaced by the acceptance of adequacy. The Celtic mystique was beginning to feel more like Celtic mythology, a collection of stories about a glorious past that had little relevance to a disappointing present. And then, from the basketball gods themselves, came salvation. Larry Joe Bird arrived in Boston in the summer of 1979, a 22-year-old forward from French Lick, Indiana, who looked like a farmer and played like a prophet. He was pale and slow and possessed of a jump shot that looked like it had been crafted by hand in some ancient workshop where basketball perfection was the only acceptable standard. Bird didn't just shoot the basketball. He communed with it, spoke to it in a language that only he understood, convinced it to do things that seemed to violate the basic laws of trajectory and physics. But shooting was just the beginning of what Bird brought to Boston. He brought an understanding of basketball that was both intuitive and intellectual, a court vision that allowed him to see not just what was happening, but what was about to happen, what should happen, what must happen if the Celtics were going to reclaim their rightful place atop the basketball universe. Bird's first season was a revelation. The Celtics improved by 32 wins, from 29-53 to 61-21, the single greatest one-year turnaround in NBA history. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the true significance of what had occurred. Bird had not merely improved the Celtics' win-loss record. He had restored their identity. Watching Bird play was like watching someone who had been born understanding things that other people spend lifetimes trying to learn. He knew where his teammates would be before they knew it themselves. He understood angles and spaces and timing with the kind of geometric precision that suggested he saw the basketball court not as a place of chaos, but as a perfectly ordered universe where everything happened according to discoverable laws. His passing was the stuff of legend. Not just accurate, though his passes consistently arrived at the precise moment and location where they could do the most good, but creative, imaginative, infused with the kind of basketball intelligence that turned the simple act of moving the ball from one player to another into a form of artistic expression. Bird could thread a basketball through spaces that didn't seem to exist, deliver it with the kind of touch that suggested he was handing his teammate a piece of priceless porcelain, rather than a leather sphere designed to be bounced on hardwood floors. And his competitiveness was absolute. Not the showy, look-at-me competitiveness of lesser players, but the quiet, grinding, relentless competitiveness of someone who understood that losing was not just disappointing but fundamentally unacceptable. Bird approached every game, every practice, every individual possession with the kind of intensity that suggested his personal worth as a human being was somehow tied to the outcome. He was not content to play well. He demanded that everyone around him play well too, and he had a way of making that demand feel less like pressure and more like privilege. The supporting cast that assembled around Bird was perfectly chosen, as if Red Auerbach had spent decades learning exactly what kind of players belonged in Celtic green. Robert Parrish arrived in 1980, a 7-foot center with the kind of quiet consistency that championship teams require. Parrish didn't dominate games in the statistical sense. He simply made sure that his team never lost games because the center position was a weakness. He was reliable in the way that great architecture is reliable, present without being ostentatious, essential without being obvious. Kevin McHale came in 1980 as well, a 6'10" forward with the longest arms in basketball history, and the kind of low-post moves that looked like they had been developed in some secret laboratory where scientists studied the optimal ways to score over taller defenders. McHale could play basketball in spaces so small that most players wouldn't have attempted shots, and he could do so with a success rate that suggested he was operating according to different physical laws than everyone else on the court. Cedric Maxwell was the kind of player that championship teams always seem to have, but rarely get proper credit for. Not spectacular, not flashy, not the kind of player whose jersey gets retired or whose number gets called when the game is on the line, but absolutely essential. A connector who understood how to make good players great and great players legendary. Maxwell was the oil that kept the Celtic machine running smoothly, the player who did the necessary things that never showed up in box scores but always showed up in victories. Danny Ainge brought energy and fearlessness, the kind of competitive fire that sometimes spilled over into actual fire. Ainge was not afraid to take big shots or make big plays or get into confrontations with players twice his size if that's what the situation required. He was an instigator in the best possible sense, someone who could raise the competitive level of everyone around him simply by refusing to be intimidated by reputation or circumstance. And orchestrating all of it was K.C. Jones as coach, a man who understood that his job was not to impose his will on this collection of talent, but to create an environment where their individual brilliance could combine into collective greatness. Jones had been a Celtic as a player during the Russell era, and he brought to his coaching the same quiet intelligence that had made him a perfect complement to more flamboyant teammates. He didn't need to be the star. He just needed to make sure the stars shone as brightly as possible. This was the core of the team that would dominate the 1980s, that would restore the Celtic mystique to its rightful prominence, that would remind the basketball world what sustained excellence looked like when it was pursued with the kind of relentless intelligence that had always defined the franchise. But even as this new Celtic dynasty was taking shape, something else was happening in basketball that would define the decade, and, in many ways, the sport itself. A young man named Irvin Johnson was making his own mark in Los Angeles, leading the Lakers with the kind of flashy, up-tempo basketball that seemed to represent everything the Celtics were not. Where the Celtics were workmanlike, the Lakers were artistic. Where the Celtics were blue-collar, the Lakers were Hollywood. Where the Celtics ground out victories through intelligence and will, the Lakers dazzled opponents into submission through speed and style. The stage was set for a rivalry that would transcend sports and become something closer to cultural warfare. Bird versus Magic, Celtics versus Lakers, East Coast versus West Coast, substance versus style. The fundamental question was not just which team was better, but which approach to basketball, and perhaps to life itself, was more admirable, more sustainable, more worthy of celebration. Their first finals meeting came in 1984, and it felt like the basketball world held its breath for 2 weeks. This was not just athletic competition, it was the collision of two philosophies, two ways of understanding what it meant to be great. The Lakers had won the championship the year before, playing their signature fast-break basketball with such precision and flair that it seemed to redefine what was possible on a basketball court. The Celtics had spent the year methodically working their way back to championship contention, grinding through the Eastern Conference playoffs with the kind of deliberate excellence that had always characterized the franchise. Game 1 was played in Boston Garden on May 27, 1984, and the building was electric in a way that transcended normal crowd enthusiasm. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something special, something that would be remembered and discussed and analyzed for decades. The Celtics won 109-97, with Bird scoring 24 points and doing the kinds of little things: rebounds, assists, steals, hustle plays, that never showed up adequately in statistical summaries, but always showed up in final scores. The series became an instant classic, each game a study in contrasting styles, each victory a statement about competing visions of basketball excellence. The Lakers would push the pace, trying to turn the games into track meets where their superior athleticism could overwhelm Celtic intelligence. The Celtics would slow things down, forcing the Lakers to execute in half-court situations where every possession required the kind of precision and patience that championship basketball demands. Game 4 was the series-defining moment, though not for any single play or performance. The game was played in Los Angeles, and the Lakers led by 5 points with less than 2 minutes remaining. By every conventional measure, they should have won. They were the more athletic team. They were playing at home. They had the momentum that comes from seizing control of a game that had seemed to be slipping away. But the Celtics did what the Celtics had always done in such situations. They simply refused to lose. Bird hit a three-pointer with 1 minute and 6 seconds remaining. Parrish made a crucial defensive stop. Maxwell converted a difficult layup with 35 seconds left. When the final horn sounded, the Celtics had won 129-125 in overtime, and the series had shifted in a way that felt permanent and irreversible. The Celtics won the series in 7 games, capturing their 15th championship with a 111-102 victory in Boston Garden. But the significance of that championship went far beyond the addition of another trophy to the franchise's collection. It represented the restoration of something that had been lost, the reassertion of principles that had been temporarily forgotten, the demonstration that intelligence and will could still triumph over style and athleticism if they were applied with sufficient commitment and precision. Bird was named Finals MVP, but the award seemed almost beside the point. This had not been about individual achievement. This had been about the validation of an entire way of approaching basketball, an entire philosophy of what it meant to compete at the highest level. The Celtics had not just beaten the Lakers. They had proven that their way, the Celtic way, was still relevant, still effective, still capable of producing championships in an era when many observers assumed that basketball had evolved beyond such old-fashioned concepts. The rivalry continued throughout the decade, each finals meeting between the teams feeling like a summit conference between superpowers. The Lakers won in 1985, getting their revenge with a 6-game series victory that featured some of the most beautiful basketball ever played. Magic Johnson was magnificent, running the Showtime offense with the kind of precision that made fast-break basketball look easy. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was still Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, still capable of the skyhook that remained the most unstoppable shot in basketball history. But the Celtics won in 1986, and that championship was perhaps their most complete, their most dominant, their most perfect expression of what the franchise represented. They went 67-15 in the regular season, then lost only one game in the entire playoffs. One game. Think about that for a moment. 15 playoff victories in 16 tries. A championship run that was so thoroughly comprehensive that it seemed to mock the very concept of competitive balance. That 1986 team was basketball perfection made manifest. Bird was at the absolute peak of his powers, playing basketball with the kind of complete command that suggested he could see several moves ahead of everyone else on the court. Parrish and McHale formed the most formidable front court in basketball, combining Parrish's consistency with McHale's creativity into a force that no opposing team could adequately prepare for. The bench was deep and intelligent, filled with players who understood their roles perfectly and executed them with the kind of precision that only comes from years of playing together. But perhaps most importantly, the 1986 Celtics understood something about winning that has never been adequately captured in words. They understood that championship basketball was not about being good enough to win. It was about being so good that losing became literally inconceivable. It was about raising the standard of play to such heights that opponents were defeated not by superior talent, but by superior commitment to an ideal that transcended individual achievement. The decade continued with its rhythm of Celtic-Laker supremacy, the two franchises trading championships like old friends sharing stories. The Lakers won in 1987 and 1988, both times over the Celtics, but even in defeat there was something admirable about the way these teams competed. They brought out the best in each other, pushed each other to heights that neither could have achieved in isolation, demonstrated that true greatness requires worthy opposition. But as the 1980s drew to a close, age began to take its toll on the Celtic dynasty. Bird's back was betraying him, the accumulation of years spent diving for loose balls and playing through pain finally demanding payment. Parrish was still effective, but no longer dominant. McHale's feet were causing him increasing problems, limiting his mobility and reducing his effectiveness in the low post. More troubling than the physical deterioration was something less tangible but equally real. The culture that had sustained the Celtic mystique for 4 decades was beginning to show signs of stress. The commitment to excellence that had once been automatic was now requiring conscious effort. The standards that had once been non-negotiable were now subject to discussion and debate. The early 1990s were a gradual descent from greatness, punctuated by moments of brilliance that reminded everyone what the Celtics were capable of when everything aligned properly. But such alignments were becoming increasingly rare. Bird retired in 1992, taking with him not just his individual brilliance but the institutional memory of what it meant to be a Celtic at the highest level. The team that emerged in the 1990s was talented but not transcendent, good but not great, competitive but not championship caliber. They made the playoffs regularly but never seriously threatened to win championships. They had good players, D. Brown, Rick Fox, David Wesley, but they lacked the kind of transformative talent that could elevate an entire organization. This was unfamiliar territory for a franchise that had grown accustomed to measuring success only in terms of championships. For the first time since the early 1950s, the Celtics were ordinary. Not bad, not embarrassing, just ordinary. And for an organization built on the idea that ordinary was unacceptable, this was perhaps the most difficult period in franchise history. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a wilderness period, characterized by well-intentioned efforts that never quite achieved their intended results. The team drafted promising young players who never quite developed into stars. They signed veteran free agents who never quite recaptured their previous excellence. They hired coaches who never quite figured out how to restore the Celtic mystique to its former prominence. Paul Pierce arrived in 1998, a forward from Kansas who brought the kind of scoring ability that championship teams require. Pierce could score from anywhere on the court, in any situation, against any defender. He had the kind of competitive fire that Celtic fans recognized and appreciated. But one player, no matter how talented, cannot single-handedly resurrect a dynasty. Pierce spent years carrying teams that were good enough to make the playoffs, but not good enough to win championships. Talented enough to be respectable, but not talented enough to be special. The nadir came in 2006-07, when the Celtics finished 24-58, their worst record in franchise history. For an organization that had won 16 championships, that had defined excellence in professional sports for half a century, this was not just disappointing, it was existentially threatening. Had the Celtic way become irrelevant? Had basketball evolved beyond the principles that had once made the franchise untouchable? But sometimes, in the depths of despair, Providence intervenes. The summer of 2007 brought a series of trades that seemed almost too good to be true. Kevin Garnett arrived from Minnesota, bringing with him the kind of defensive intensity and leadership that had been missing from Boston for years. Ray Allen came from Seattle, adding the kind of pure shooting ability that makes offensive systems function at optimal efficiency. Suddenly, Pierce was no longer carrying the entire load. He was part of something larger, something that resembled the kind of collective excellence that had always defined Celtic basketball. The transformation was immediate and complete. The 2007-08 Celtics went 66-16 in the regular season, a 42-game improvement that remains the largest single-season turnaround in NBA history. But the regular season was merely preparation for what really mattered: the restoration of the Celtic championship tradition. The playoffs that year were a journey back to greatness, each series a reminder of what the franchise had always represented. The Celtics defeated Atlanta, Cleveland, and Detroit to reach the finals, setting up a matchup with the Lakers that felt like destiny. Bird versus Magic was over, but Celtics versus Lakers was eternal. The 2008 finals were everything that basketball could be when played at its highest level. The Lakers were talented and experienced, led by Kobe Bryant at the peak of his powers. Bryant was perhaps the most gifted individual scorer in basketball history, capable of single-handedly determining the outcome of games through sheer force of will and skill. But the Celtics had something that transcended individual brilliance. They had rediscovered what it meant to be Celtic. Garnett brought a defensive presence that hadn't been seen in Boston since Bill Russell roamed the parquet floor. He didn't just guard his man, he protected space, communicated constantly, turned the act of playing defense into a form of athletic evangelism. His intensity was infectious, spreading through the roster like electricity through copper wire. When Garnett screamed, "Anything is possible." After winning the championship, he wasn't just celebrating a victory. He was proclaiming a fundamental truth about what human beings can accomplish when they commit themselves completely to something larger than their individual ambitions. Allen provided the kind of shooting that turned good offensive possessions into great ones. His three-point shots didn't just add points to the scoreboard. They demoralized opponents, shifted momentum, created the kind of psychological advantages that championship teams require. But more than his shooting, Allen brought a professionalism and attention to detail that exemplified everything the Celtic tradition represented. His pre-game routines were legendary in their precision, his work habits mythical in their consistency. Pierce, finally surrounded by talent that matched his own, blossomed into the kind of clutch performer that Celtic history demanded. He scored when scoring was required, rebounded when rebounding was necessary, defended when defense was crucial. Pierce understood that being a Celtic meant accepting responsibility for everything that happened on the court. And he embraced that responsibility with the kind of wholehearted commitment that had defined franchise legends for 6 decades. The series against the Lakers went 6 games, each one a study in the subtle art of championship basketball. Game 4 was the series' turning point, though it would take the full scope of history to understand its significance. The Celtics were trailing 2-1 in the series and facing elimination of their championship dreams. They led by 24 points in the third quarter, playing the kind of suffocating basketball that had characterized their entire season. Then the Lakers rallied, cutting the lead to 2 points with less than 7 minutes remaining. What happened next was pure Celtic mystique made manifest. They didn't panic. They didn't abandon their principles. They simply executed, possession after possession, with the kind of calm determination that comes from absolute confidence in preparation and teammates. Garnett made crucial defensive stops. Allen hit impossible shots. Pierce scored when points were essential. When it was over, the Celtics had won 97-91, and the psychological momentum of the series had shifted permanently in their favor. Game 6 was played in Boston Garden on June 17, 2008, 22 years to the day after the Celtics had won their most recent championship. The building was electric in a way that only comes when an entire city understands that something special is about to happen. The Celtics led by as many as 28 points, playing basketball with the kind of precision and passion that had defined the franchise's greatest moments. When the final horn sounded on a 131-92 victory, the largest margin of victory in finals clinching game history, the celebration was both joyous and somehow inevitable. This is what the Celtics were meant to be. This is what the Celtic way had always promised. Not just victory, but victory achieved through the kind of collective commitment that transforms individual talents into something approaching perfection. The championship was Boston's 17th, tying them with the Lakers for the most in NBA history. But numbers, as always with the Celtics, told only part of the story. This championship represented something more profound than the addition of another trophy to the franchise's collection. It represented the validation of principles that many had begun to consider obsolete. The demonstration that the Celtic way, intelligence over athleticism, team over individual, substance over style, remained relevant in a modern basketball world that seemed increasingly focused on individual achievement and statistical accumulation. But even as they celebrated, everyone understood that this championship was both a culmination and a beginning. Garnett, Pierce, and Allen were not young men. Their window for sustained excellence was necessarily limited. If the Celtics were going to build another dynasty, they would need to do so quickly, efficiently, with the kind of tactical precision that had always characterized the franchise's most successful periods. The following seasons brought varying degrees of success and frustration. The 2008-9 team was perhaps more talented than the championship squad, but injuries and age began to take their toll. They reached the Eastern Conference semifinals before falling to Orlando, a defeat that felt like opportunity squandered rather than season concluded. The 2009-10 team made an improbable run to the finals, defeating LeBron James and Cleveland in a series that showcased everything that remained great about Celtic basketball: intelligence, determination, the refusal to accept defeat until defeat was mathematically certain. The 2010 finals against the Lakers were a 7-game epic that felt like the conclusion of something that had begun 30 years earlier. These were the same franchises, playing for the same stakes, representing the same competing visions of basketball excellence. The series was decided by the smallest of margins: a few key shots, a few crucial defensive stops, a few moments when championship experience proved more valuable than individual talent. The Lakers won 83-79 in Game 7, but the Celtics had proven something almost as valuable as a championship. They had demonstrated that the Celtic mystique was not merely historical artifact but living principle, something that could be channeled and applied even in an era when basketball had ostensibly evolved beyond such old-fashioned concepts as collective sacrifice and institutional commitment. The years that followed brought the inevitable decline that accompanies aging superstars and salary cap limitations. Garnett and Allen eventually departed, taking with them not just their individual talents but the institutional knowledge of what it meant to be a Celtic in the 21st century. Pierce remained, becoming the bridge between the championship era and whatever came next, carrying the torch with the kind of dignity and professionalism that had always characterized the franchise's greatest players. His retirement ceremony in 2017 was an emotional farewell, not just to a great player, but to an entire era of Celtic basketball. Pierce had spent 19 seasons in Boston, through the lean years and the championship seasons, through rebuilding efforts and championship parades. He had embodied the Celtic tradition as completely as any player in franchise history, demonstrating that excellence was not about individual statistics, but about commitment to something larger than oneself. But even as one era ended, another was beginning. The Celtics of the late 2010s and early 2020s have been built around a different model, but guided by the same principles that have always defined the franchise. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown represent the future of Celtic basketball. Young, talented, committed to the idea that individual success means nothing without collective achievement. They are still learning what it means to be Celtic, still discovering the subtle differences between being good and being great, between winning games and winning championships. The journey has not been without setbacks. The 2018 team reached the Eastern Conference Finals despite missing its two best players to injury, demonstrating the kind of collective resilience that has always characterized Celtic basketball. The 2019 and 2020 teams struggled with chemistry and consistency, learning the difficult lesson that talent alone is insufficient for championship success. But the foundation remains solid. The culture remains intact. The expectation of excellence remains non-negotiable. When Tatum scores 50 points in a playoff game, when Brown makes a crucial defensive stop in the final seconds, when the team executes a perfect possession in the closing moments of a tight game, you can see glimpses of what the Celtics have always been and what they aspire to be again. The 2022 finals run was both vindication and education. The Celtics defeated Brooklyn, Milwaukee, and Miami to reach the finals, each series a masterclass in the kind of basketball that has always defined the franchise. They didn't have the most talented roster in the playoffs, but they had something more valuable. They understood how to win the games that mattered most. The finals against Golden State were a reminder that championship basketball requires more than talent, more than preparation, more than desire. It requires the kind of collective wisdom that only comes from experiencing the highest levels of pressure and responding with the kind of poise that separates good teams from great ones. The Warriors won in 6 games, but the Celtics had announced themselves as legitimate championship contenders, as heirs to a tradition that demands nothing less than excellence in pursuit of ultimate success. As we sit here now, in 2025, the Celtics remain what they have always been. A franchise defined not by any individual player or coach, but by an idea, a standard, a commitment to the proposition that basketball, played correctly, is something approaching art. They are 18-time champions, tied with the Lakers for the most in NBA history. But their legacy transcends championships won or lost. The Celtic mystique is not about wins and losses, though wins and losses are certainly part of it. It's about the understanding that excellence is not a destination but a journey, not an achievement but a commitment, not a moment but a lifetime. It's about the recognition that individual talents, no matter how spectacular, are meaningful only when channeled toward a collective purpose. Every young player who puts on a Celtic uniform inherits this tradition, whether he understands it or not. Every coach who accepts the responsibility of leading this franchise accepts the obligation to uphold standards that were established long before he arrived and will endure long after he's gone. Every fan who cheers for the Celtics participates in something larger than sports, something that speaks to fundamental questions about what it means to pursue excellence in a world that often settles for adequacy. The parquet floor at TD Garden still bears the ghostly presence of everyone who has ever worn Celtic green. Russell's blocked shots still echo in the rafters. Cousie's passes still slice through the air with impossible precision. Bird's jump shots still find their mark with mathematical certainty. The championship banners hang like prayers made manifest, like dreams achieved through the kind of sustained commitment that most people cannot fathom and few organizations can sustain. This is what the Boston Celtics represent: the possibility that excellence is achievable, that greatness is sustainable, that the pursuit of perfection is not futile but noble. They are a reminder that in a world increasingly focused on individual achievement and statistical accumulation, there remains value in the older virtues: sacrifice, commitment, the willingness to subordinate personal goals to collective purpose. The story of the Boston Celtics is not finished. It cannot be finished as long as there are young men willing to commit themselves to something larger than their individual ambitions, as long as there are coaches willing to demand excellence rather than merely hope for it, as long as there are fans willing to support the pursuit of championship basketball, even when such pursuit requires patience, understanding, and faith in principles that are easier to abandon than to maintain. Every season brings new possibilities. Every draft brings the potential saviors. Every trade brings the possibility of the perfect combination of talent and chemistry that can transform good teams into great ones. But the constant, the foundation upon which everything else is built, remains the same: the Celtic way, the Celtic standard, the Celtic commitment to the idea that basketball, played correctly, is something beautiful and meaningful and worthy of our deepest respect. In the end, that is what this franchise represents. Not just basketball success, though they have certainly achieved that. Not just athletic excellence, though they have consistently demonstrated that. But something more enduring and more important: the demonstration that human beings, working together toward a common purpose with intelligence and commitment, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than their best effort, can achieve things that seem impossible to those who have never attempted such achievement. The Boston Celtics are more than a basketball team. They are a living argument for the possibility of sustained excellence, a continuing education in the art of collective commitment, a master class in the subtle science of transforming individual talents into championship teams. They are, in the most fundamental sense, what all of us aspire to be: better today than we were yesterday, better tomorrow than we are today, always in pursuit of something worthy of our finest efforts. This is their legacy. This is their gift to basketball and to sport, and to anyone who has ever wondered what human beings can accomplish when they commit themselves completely to something larger than themselves. The Boston Celtics, forever pursuing perfection, forever falling short, forever beginning again the next day with the same commitment, the same standards, the same absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence. The story continues. The tradition endures. The mystique lives on.